Well, the day is finally here. Canadians cast their votes today to decide the next federal government. So with a closer look at what the latest polls are saying and how the results could unfold, we're joined by pollster Darrell Bricker, Ipsos CEO of Public Affairs. Darrell, great to see you. This is the day we've all been waiting for. Oh, my goodness. Let's take a look at the numbers. They are extremely tight. I want to get your interpretation of this. And given that, is it all but really impossible for a majority government to be formed tonight?
Well, based on what we're looking right now, I mean, anything can happen. There's a lot of loose ends here that need to be tied up. So, but looking at these numbers, if this is what plays out today as Canadians vote, yeah, it's very hard to see how anybody has a route to a majority government.
So the national polls are one thing, but of course it comes down to how this is converted and translated into those key battlegrounds. And some of these races across the country are very tight. And we're looking at potentially dozens of ridings that are really, really close. Talk about some of the ones that you are looking at and some of the regions you're looking at.
Okay, so viewers are looking at this and saying, why is he saying this is so tight? I mean, didn't the Conservatives win the popular vote last time around by 1 point? And isn't that what we have right now? But the truth is, the distribution of votes this time is very different. So, for example, we're seeing Ontario, where the Liberals had a 10-point lead last time going into the election and actually delivered that on election day. Well, that's down to 4. And that's where, it's incredibly tight, particularly in the 905, where a number of seats could switch between the Liberals and the Conservatives and the NDP. A lot to work out today. And then British Columbia is the other place that's very, very tight. And we see the NDP on the top of the race at the moment, with the Liberals in 3rd place. This was a place where Justin Trudeau was hoping to break through in order to form his majority, and it hasn't happened. So those are the places we're really watching very closely. So it could be a very late night tonight, Anthony.
My goodness, yeah. So given all this, is it possible we won't even know tonight?
Well, there is some possibility. Elections Canada tells us they're not going to be counting the mail-in ballots, which are somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million ballots. Now, granted, about 18 million Canadians vote in an election campaign, so it's not a huge number, but 4 or 5% of the ballots probably will come in by mail today. And in some of those tight races, it could actually make a difference. So, yeah, we may not know what the conclusion is tonight until those mail ballots are counted.
Now, Darrell, you've been following the numbers very closely, and as you know, there is a lot of frustration, a lot of anger throughout this country for many reasons, obviously including a lot of people have lost their livelihood because of pandemic protocols. Vaccine passports is a major issue across this country. Given all that and the potential for the protest vote, how much of a wild card is the People's Party of Canada?
Well, in the last election campaign, they got about 1.6% of the vote, so didn't win any ridings, really weren't much of a factor. This time around, depending on the poll that you believe, they're going to do a lot better than that. In our polling, they're about 4%. Not enough to maybe win very many seats or any seats at all, but certainly enough to bleed some votes away from people that are in really tight races. So if we're right and it's about 4%, not a huge impact, potentially at the margins, but if we're wrong and it's a bigger number, then they could be a force in terms of deciding who forms or who wins the election tonight.
Have you ever seen an election like this where it's so tight that the leaders of the two main parties have as much chance of becoming prime minister as they do potentially being out of a job if they lose this election?
Yeah, the one that this reminds me the most of is 2004 and 2006, both minority governments in which Stephen Harper went up against Paul Martin. In 2004, Paul Martin, with a very late surge over the course of the weekend before voting on Monday, ended up squeaking out a minority government. In 2006, it was Stephen Harper who was able to achieve that. So it reminds me of that, and I would ask people to think back to those and decide in your minds right now whether we're living with 2004 or 2006, and that's probably the election that we're going to have.
So Justin Trudeau called this election, obviously, we don't have a lot of time, Darrell, but he called this to win the majority.
Sure.
It's very difficult to win that tonight, given those numbers. What factors led to this miscalculation? We have about 30 seconds.
Well, I think he looked at his pandemic record. He looked at his numbers compared to his opponents and decided he was going to steal a march on them, and ended up stumbling out of the starting gate and really misread how Canadians were going to respond to being put in this situation where they're being forced to vote today.
Well, Darrell, I know you're going to have a long day and a long night. We appreciate all of the work you have done and will continue to do. That is Darrell Bricker, Ipsos CEO of Public Affairs. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks, Anthony.